Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. We will begin our afternoon with competitiveness dialogue on the policy landscape for global competitiveness. This panel will be moderated by Ganesh Rasajam, Practice Manager of the World Bank, at the World Bank. And joining him will be His Excellency Tai-Shen Kwan, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Research Institute and former Minister of the Korean Prime Minister's Office, Dr. Bashir Al-Ghurayid, Executive Director and Secretary General of the U.S.-Saudi Business Council, Mr. Ashraf Naguib, Co-founder and CEO of Global Trade Matters, Mr. Yanis Grammatidis, Honorary President of the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, gentlemen.
Naguib, over to you.
Gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to be with you on the panel. I want to start off by thanking His Royal Highness for having us here. It's my first time in Saudi Arabia. Deborah, thank you for having me and the great work of the GFCC. I'm here basically to represent number 116 on the Global Competitiveness Index, and I believe that is going to make for a fantastic business case and a business study for all GFCC members here. I'd like to pick your brains and your minds on what we should be doing in a country like Egypt that does have a population of about 80 million people with a growth rate of about 2.4 million people on an annual basis. A country that only uses about 6% of its 1 million kilometers squared. So if we are looking at the potential for growth in infrastructure, in the development of new cities and urban communities, there is no better place in probably the next decade than Egypt. Unfortunately, we face a lot of challenges, many challenges, and the reason behind that is not that we are a small economy or an incapable group of people, but the reality is we are 7,000 years old, and unlike a lot of the younger nations around us that have had the opportunity to almost start from scratch, we have two challenges ahead of us. It is to fix what we have basically destroyed in the past, and for us to be able to build into the future. Again, 1 million square meters of space, we only use 6% of it. With that type of population growth, there is an impact on global climate that can affect some of our biggest cities on the Mediterranean coast. So I hope that I can share with you some of the opportunities, some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of infrastructure, economic development, and more specifically, and I think from some of the questions that I was asking yesterday, you realize that I'm very much interested in understanding what it is that we need to do after two revolutions in 4 years in revising, and I think there should be a third revolution, and don't get me wrong, the third revolution has to be an economic revolution. And today, we are trying to formulate the proper economic policies, not just the regulations as we were talking yesterday, but the fiscal policies that will be able to move Egypt forward within the next century. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I have a question for Ashraf. What do you think needs to happen in terms of the regulatory environment to raise the competitiveness of not only Egypt, but the Arab world? I know we had a discussion over lunch where you mentioned agreements, pan-Arab agreements, so on and so forth. So what's your view towards that, and how is that related to competitiveness?
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Ashraf now. You talked about Egypt in your opening remarks, and I'm going to ask you, from what you've heard so far, what are the challenges that Egypt is facing in this space, and what are the lessons for Egypt as well as for other countries in tackling the competitiveness challenges?
Let me try and integrate His Royal Highness's question to me on trade earlier and integrate it in what was being said here. Now, with a fantastic group of thought leaders sitting in the same room, I think we all subscribe to the principles of free market economics, global trade, and the principles of globalization, or else we would not be here. And I subscribe to that as well. A very adamant student of Milton Friedman, and at the same time, a very adamant student of a person like Frank Nader. And their balance of ideas on both sides is one talks about free market economics and free markets with very, very little government intervention, as you were saying, more of a regulator than a participant in the economy, while Milton Friedman, while Frank Nader talks about how government should be more involved. I also subscribe to the notion of decentralization of our economic policies in Egypt. There's no doubt about it, whether it is the election of governors, whether it is the decentralization of the fiscal policy and our taxes. All of these have to be put together for us to be able to face some of the challenges that we have. We cannot try to be part of a global economy when we're still thinking with the principles of a socialist economy. And I think Korea is a fantastic example. And almost 40 years ago, 30 years ago, Korea used to send us delegations to see what Egypt was doing. And today we're sending delegations to South Korea to see what they have done so successfully. Now, some of the challenges that we face in Egypt specifically is our economic and fiscal policy. Again, we are trying to protect an industry that doesn't exist. For example, 300% customs on vehicles, while we don't have an industry to produce vehicles, we assemble. The other issue that we are facing is within our concept of trade. We are signatories to some of the largest trade agreements and protocols and MOUs. Let me even state that we are part of the COMESA, we're part of GAFTA, PAFTA, Agadir, the Association Agreement, Union of the Mediterranean, Qualified Industrial Zones, and I can go on. Okay, but the principle is that we have a deficit, basically, in the Egypt-Turkey FTA as well. We have a deficit on our trade with basically all of these, or under all of these agreements. Now, the idea is that every time one of our ministers goes to visit a country, Deborah, you know, 2004, 2005, 2007, we got the National Competitiveness Council put in Egypt, didn't do much, and we were talking at the time on a free trade agreement with the United States. That hasn't happened, won't happen for quite some time, and in return we have something like the Qualified Industrial Zones. Now, if we take an agreement like the association agreement, which is part of the European Union, and the whole principle of it is for us to be able to work together, African countries, some of the Arab countries as well, that hasn't happened. I was talking to His Royal Highness today over lunch, and I was asking him specifically, what can we do to reinvigorate the principles of our trade agreements and our free trade areas between the Arab nations? And I totally agree with him that we need to go back and re-revise some of the clauses and terms and regulations of these agreements to fit more with the current situation that is happening specifically after the Arab Spring. And in addition to the amazing technological advancements that we have seen and heard about yesterday and this morning. So trade is great, but if you don't have a vibrant manufacturing sector with these new technologies, for you to be able to compete with your products. I'm also the Secretary General of the Asia-Egypt Business Association, and I ask a lot of our friends in South Korea and India and China, why do you not buy our products? Why are Egyptian products not doing well in these countries? Well, the first thing they talk about is quality. Our products, our manufacturing productivity in terms of quality is extremely low and lacks competitiveness. And that is again because we have an interference from the state, not as a regulator, but also as a market participant. And not just a regular market participant, but that acquires about 30 to 40% of the actual business that happens in Egypt. Now we're talking about a government, instead of actually focusing on the regulation and formulating bright and sound fiscal policy, they're producing T-shirts and light bulbs and, underwears, and that is not the role of the government. And there is no way that an entity, a state, can put down the regulations and the policies that they have an exception from, whether it's in taxes, whether it's paying its energy. So one of the major issues that we're facing is the intervention of government in the market as a participant, and I'm not even going to talk about the military's participation in the Egyptian markets as well. And if I don't say that, then I wouldn't be giving the whole picture. So the private sector is competing against very tough regulations in Egypt, competing with a very strong market participant in the form of the government and the military. And we don't have a competitive edge in terms of either technology or even manufacturing regular products. Trade agreements were supposed to open this up and give us the opportunity to be able to compete on a much bigger level. But let's look at these trade agreements and see why they have hindered actually the progress of Egyptian manufacturing and Egyptian competitiveness. And one of the reasons, like the association agreement, it is built on a tariff dismantling schedule, which lasts up to about 17 to 20 years. Now, we believe that is the right way to go about it when dealing with smaller economies. You have to give them some room for them to be able to at least, grow the capacities and build the capacities that they need to be able to compete. But unfortunately, now, by probably 2017, EU products will be entering Egyptian market at zero customs. Now, what was the impact of that? That we have companies like BMW and companies like Mercedes that are assemblers currently. They're closing down their assembly factories in Egypt and moving out because it will become cheaper for them to be able to just import the cars directly from Europe. But the Egyptian government thinks about it this way. They put a 300% custom on cars that are imported. Now, since there's no customs after the tariff dismantling schedule, what they're doing now is going to impose a 300% tax on the vehicles. Okay, so it is through the sound policy of the government and the lack of intervention, in a sense, within the market that we need very much so. And after two revolutions, we need to have an economic revolution, understanding exactly what is our fiscal policy. And I emphasize the fiscal policy because we take a look at examples of South Korea. I take a look at an example of Chile in the 70s. Okay, and that was one of the major questions that we were faced with post the revolution in 2011, and it's still posed now. How do we go about this? What are we going to do? How are we going to set the right policies, the right fiscal policies? What kind of economic system do we want? Until 2007, Egypt had an economic system that was called a socialist democratic economic system. I couldn't understand it because it sort of contradicts itself in a sense. But when we talk about the socialist part of it, you have to understand that Egypt is a subsidized economy. And as long as you are subsidizing your food and your water and your growth and your education and your health and not doing a very good job out of it either. Because in true honesty, while we have subsidized everything, nothing's really for free. So they say subsidized and free education. Are they really getting an education? Absolutely not. And if you look at the corruption index, education actually in Egypt falls under the corruption index. Very, very funny story. Because very simply, students don't go to public schools. The teachers don't teach them because they get very, very small salaries. And hence they give them private lessons, which the students pay for. So why don't you just let the students pay for the education and put the wages up higher? Another very ironic concept is Egypt again suffers from the malices of corruption in government, in private sector, in all levels of society. We're all corrupt in a sense. You don't put a maximum wage on your markets. We have a minimum wage, which I completely agree with, but at the same time, we've put a maximum wage. So when we're talking about competitiveness, there is absolutely no incentive for anyone to be able to want to become better or to compete, because at the end of the day, it is 42,000 Egyptian pounds that you get. That's the maximum. If you were an Einstein in Egypt, you would get 42,000 Egyptian pounds. So I'm sorry it took too long, but
thank you, Ashraf. That was a very sobering list of, that was very pragmatic, very sobering. I'll come back to you.
Okay, thank you. I have a question to the panelists. And I'll be extremely happy if each one of them try to answer it from his perspective or the perspective of his country. You see, you have different situations in different geographies, as we can see from the four cases. So what would be the single, like say, #1 policy change to improve your relative competitiveness position?
Ashraf, 30 seconds. Wonderful.
Very briefly, just to answer your question, the one single component, in my opinion, is the word balance. As Egyptians, we like to build things big. We built the pyramids. We think bigger is better. And we apply the same notion in government as well and in businesses, because you have very little, very small real building capacity in small, medium enterprises and microfinance in Egypt. So we believe in what is big. To answer your question, it is a balance. It's a balance between government that does a job, private sector that understands what it has to do and looks for its profitability, and of course, civil society. Let me finally say that also in competitiveness, conflicts hinder competitiveness, but it's not just the current conflicts, because I just want to make a statement to everyone here. Egypt needs an investment of about 20 billion US dollars for us to be able to remove over 23 million mines that are still scattered around the western desert of Egypt. And that on its own is hindering our progress and our development in an area that is full of natural resources, that is a potential for new urban communities and cities. We have aquifers of water that would last us for another 7 to 1,000 years, agricultural land and flat land. So these are some of the issues on the long run that we would like to address with our friends, the allies, and maybe the international community as well, to be able to take away some of what is hindering our future competitiveness in a very big portion, almost about 20% of our land area. So to answer your question, to finalize, it is balance between all.
Panelists, thank you. It was a very lively session, and we could continue for another hour, but I think we have to vacate for the next panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.